So I think we're just going to go straight into it, and people will join us as they come. So yes, so most of us have heard things like 1.5 degrees until breaking point. We've heard things such as 12 years to sort out this climate mess. And we've heard names such as Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion. And, you know, every year it seems to be the hottest year on record. So climate change is something within our conscious. However, today we're going to be talking about climate justice. And so I want to start off by giving a quote from former Irish President Mary Robinson. And she says, "Climate justice insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart." So I want to start by telling a story. So this time last year, I was with a few friends in Bristol, and I got in a conversation with one of my friends who happens to be a white male. And basically, I was telling him that he needs to join like the anti-racist struggle, or he needs to be vocal in like admonishing injustices, like racial injustices, because unfortunately we live in a world where white males, you know, get heard more than ethnic minorities, more than women. And he responded and said, "You know, Lisa, I admire everything you're doing and I really respect it. However, I just feel for myself, I need to be, or I want to be an activist within the environmental struggle." And he was saying, you know, the environment doesn't discriminate, and environmental or climate change is going to affect everybody. And so I would rather, you know, focus on that, like no offense. And so I said, you know, in essence, you're right in saying that, yes, climate change will affect everybody. And you're right in saying that nature does not discriminate. However, climate change is not natural. It's something that has been created by the structure, you know, namely the white patriarchal power structure. And so climate change does discriminate, and it will affect, you know, Black and brown people, you know, in a nationwide context, but also in a global context. You know, it's going to affect the global south before it affects the global north. Therefore, to be an activist within the climate struggle, you need to acknowledge these disparities and this unequal burden. And so it's similar to, you know, these white feminists that we see who claim to be feminists, but they're only advocating for one side of feminism, you know, simultaneously ignoring the other side. And that doesn't work. We need to attack all of these structures that work against us.
Yeah, so I think to lead on from that, I'd like to share a quote that an old teacher of mine said to me when I was studying in France. And he said, "An earthquake never hurt anyone. It is the houses that crumble." Now, I'm fully aware of how provocative that quote is. It's obviously not literally true. But sorry, I hope you didn't hear that. My dad is screaming on the other side of the door. But what that guy was trying to say, but with that quote, is he was trying to debunk the idea that there is such a thing as a natural disaster, because his argument is that there are natural processes and they can be hazards, but there are also deeply rooted historical, political, social, and economic unequal power dynamics that have been, you know, created through time and with measures, and, you know, they've been implemented carefully. And when those hazards meet those inequalities, they become a disaster for the victims, or for the exposure units, for scientific terms. And when it becomes a disaster, the people who feel the impact are described as vulnerable. You know, they become vulnerable, and vulnerability is only a problem. Vulnerability is basically how can you deal with a hazard, not as a person, how can you deal with it, but as a collective, how many means do you have to deal with that hazard? And vulnerability is a problem when only institutionally privileged people are given the means to cope and to recover with hazards and or disasters, and others don't. So what I would answer to Lisa's friend is a quote by social scientist Nadia Ruziman, which is nature doesn't discriminate, but humans do. And I think this is very, very true, and it's reflected on global levels as well as local levels.
Yep, and so I want to begin our exploration into climate justice by first kind of laying down the link between environmental degradation and colonialism. But before, I feel the need to debunk this myth that we have of overpopulation. So I'm sure many of us have heard, within the climate change movement, people saying that climate change is linked to too many people on this planet, and often, the buck is passed on to ethnic minority women who are apparently having too many children. This argument is eco-fascist. It stems from an 18th century thinker, namely Thomas Malthus, who basically theorized that population growth was exponential and growth of food and like other resources was linear. And so he believed that the amount of food and resources that we have is not enough for the growing population. However, this theory does not really have a base. It's based on like some dodgy like economic calculations, and it is just not true. And so, standing or like moving away from that, we need to talk about who's consuming or like over consuming. We need to talk about the 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of greenhouse emissions, and remove the blame from people that aren't even consuming very much. And so now I want to get into what I want to talk about, which is climate change and colonialism. And so I want to start off by reading a quote by Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin in their book entitled The Human Planet, How We Created the Anthropocene. And just to start off, to define an Anthropocene, the Anthropocene is this current geological age in which we live, where human activity dictates or is like the strongest influence like on the environment and on the climate. So the quote goes, "The Anthropocene began with widespread colonialism and slavery. It is a story of how people treat the environment and how people treat each other." So in order to understand this, we need to deconstruct like what colonialism is. So the ultimate aim for a colonial power is that very thing, it's power. And the success of an empire directly relates to, owning more land, to controlling more populations, to retrieving more natural resources, to creating a larger trade network, and ultimately to having more money, because we all know that money is power. So how do we make this money? Obviously, like everything I just said, but also this capitalist doctrine of, spending as little as we can in order to maximize our profits. And this is a capitalist doctrine, but by extension, it's a colonial doctrine, because the capitalism that we know today was not necessarily formed, but it was molded by, slavery and colonialism and exploitation and thieving. So in order, so basically we need to, within this doctrine, we need to maximize profits, and maximizing profits by any means necessary. And so this includes, the complete disregard for people, complete disregard and exploitation of the environment. And now I just want to talk about one term here, namely manifest destiny. And so this is the idea that the first settlers, like European settlers to the Americas, believed that they were the chosen ones, believed that they had some sort of divine right to go into territories and do whatever they wanted to the people, to the land, and basically just use them as tools for their own personal gain. And so this leads us to, the decimation of populations through diseases, the decimation of land for commercial purposes. For example, mass deforestation to make way for plantations, but also to boost the timber industry, which was a time, before fossil fuels, that charcoal, was heavily used. And also, the decimation of bisons, which was an important part of Indigenous American culture. So ultimately the decimation of knowledge and this culture. So basically the principle fundamentally is, or we can say that the principle in all of this is that any exploitation is cool as long as we're making money. And this goes like with stark contrast to the indigenous population's value and belief in the sanctity of the earth. And this same colonial ideology was the catalyst for the Industrial Revolution. There would be no Industrial Revolution without slavery and colonialism, no Industrial Revolution without the money made on the backs of slaves. For example, like more specifically, there'd be no booming textile industry without black people picking cotton on land that was stolen from the indigenous population, and no climate change without this ideology of dominion over people and over land. So I want to finish this little section by re-saying that quote that I said at the beginning. The Anthropocene began with widespread colonialism and slavery. It is a story of how people treat the environment and of how people treat each other.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start off by saying poor populations have often lived in more polluted areas. This is not news. I'm originally from Paris, and the east side of the city was traditionally the most polluted area and the most poor area because the wind blew that way, and so the wind from the factories, like the toxic air, was breathed in by working class people, and the more richer populations are found in the southwest of Paris. So this is not new, and it happens on the scale of a city like Paris, or on much larger scales, like for example global levels. And so because these areas are poor, obviously they're underfunded, and that creates a lack of capacity to adapt to climate adversity when it does come around. So therefore the people become more vulnerable. And so there's of course a class issue, but in our society there is also, by extension, there is a racial issue. So we know that in the United States, for example, ghettoization was done on purpose. We know that there were measures that were taken and that were implemented, of which, the goal of those measures was to segregate Black people. So, there was redlining, blockbusting, for example, and then on a more European level, in France and in the UK, I think social spatial segregation looks different. It doesn't have the same structure, I think, as in the United States, and even within London or Paris I don't think it looks the same. But it's no surprise that poor neighborhoods are also neighborhoods where people of color are overrepresented, and in those neighborhoods you find an overrepresentation of toxic hazards, so either toxic waste deposits, or in the US maybe pipelines, things like that. And in those same neighborhoods, you find higher rates of disease, higher rates of asthma, higher rates of cancer. And so, and those people work in those environments. So I think we need to recognize the gravity of that, which is environmental racism. And because, exposure to risk like that is abuse, and you're taking away their control over their body. And but it's, and in that sense, it's felt as on an individual level, but it's also a collective experience of vulnerability because of discrimination. And I think that's it's quite important to underline. And and I think it's important to underline that discrimination is due to a system which is rooted in past implementation of white supremacist policies, and there have never been reparations or policy changes to change or alter that, or alter the power dynamic. So I don't think there's enough focus on the mechanisms of discrimination. And to give an example, I think African American people have 79% more chance to live in health hazardous areas than whites. And I think Flint is a good example of that. It's a 65% Black city. For those who don't know, General Motors emptied toxic waste into the river, which Flint is connected to. There's been lead in the water since 2014, and there has been very little to no action that has been taken in order to solve this. And this is a very textbook example of environmental racism. But also the EPA, which is the US Environmental Protection Agency, has proven that when wealthy white people are affected by industrial pollution, there is more immediate action than when non-white people are. And I think this is so clear. It's clear in Flint, it's clear in the Dakota Pipeline, it's clear in so many examples. And I think it's important to note that often indigenous movements have put forward the idea that they see toxic contamination of their communities as systematic genocide. And I think that this is really interesting because, for example, indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest have fought very hard for their fishing rights. And the thing is, they're faced with the choice of if they want to protect their culture and their traditional knowledges. This goes hand in hand with environmental protection. And I think in the fight against environmental racism, recognition of local knowledge is very important because people, indigenous or not, can identify issues within their own communities and they can help reduce and eliminate risks with their empirical evidence. You know, it's their experience. And I think this is really important because in the fight again, because this is a conversation about environmental racism, people of color are disproportionately represented in these issues. You know, they're the ones that are suffering from climate change more than us white Europeans, for example. So, so they're trying to fight within a system that doesn't recognize them or their struggles. So this lack of recognition creates a lack of participation when people should in fact be invited to, you know, not invited, but they should be given the tools to examine information, work with scientists, included in dialogue and included in decision making. And I think all of these demands have been at the forefront of environmental justice movements because environmental injustice mirrors, you know, the systemic white supremacist inequalities that are the structure of our system.
Yep, so Esau has just talked to us about environmental racism, but more within a nationwide context. So now I want to branch out and talk about environmental degradation within the global south. And I just want to make a note that when I talk about the global south, it does not mean countries in the southern hemisphere, but rather developing nations. It's a term that has replaced third world because of its problematic air. And so developing nations will suffer the most. You know, similarly to what Esau was talking about, marginalized communities within a nation will suffer the most, but on a global scale, it's the developing nations that will suffer more greatly. And so the 50 least developed nations in the world only contribute 1% to the overall global greenhouse emissions. So this is wildly unjust considering that they didn't even create it, and they are also battling things such as poverty, hunger, poor health, lack of shelter. And you know, it's a colonial issue, and therefore it is also a race issue because this is black and brown people that are going to be more affected. And so I just want to tell a story of Zambia. So as I said at the beginning, I'm half Zambian, and I was recently in Zambia for about 6 months. And whilst I was there, we were experiencing something called load shedding. And so load shedding is where for maybe a whole day or maybe half a day or maybe a few hours of a day, but usually it's every day, there will be no power. And this is because Zambia is reliant on hydropower. So Zambia is home to Victoria Falls, which is one of the natural wonders of the world. But because of lack of rainfall, the falls was dry. And because of lack of rainfall, there was not enough water to fill the dam, and therefore not enough water to generate electricity. And this affects businesses because if your business relies on power, which you know in this age it almost certainly does, then your business is going to go underwater. And unless you can afford a generator, but obviously not many people can. Also, you know, this drought affects the agriculture, and Zambia relies heavily on the agriculture industry. So we can see, you know, the economic cost of climate change already surfacing within Zambia. And this is not an individual story. I'm just telling this story because, you know, I've been to Zambia recently, but this scenario plays out in many different developing nations. But moreover, we can also talk about, you know, natural disasters and how that impacts the global south and black and brown people more. So here I want to give the example of the Atlantic hurricane seasons. So every year in the Atlantic, there's a hurricane season. However, the last 4 years have been above average. This means that in each of these seasons, in each of these years, there's at least one Category 5 hurricane. And so Category 5 is the worst category of hurricane, and it means that it can cause catastrophic damage. And, you know, to give some example of this, the 2017 hurricane season within the Atlantic became the costliest tropical cyclone season on record, causing $300 billion of damage. The 2019 Hurricane Dorian became the worst hurricane on record to hit the Bahamas. And so, you know, this is affecting Caribbean nations who are already suffering from the effects of colonialism, and now they're suffering this. And yes, we could say that these hurricanes are also hitting, you know, southeasterly states of the US, but within these states, it's still Black and brown people who are worst affected. And, you know, there's so many examples that we can talk about, but you know, we could be here forever talking about them. I'm just going to give you one more, and that is the 2019 cyclones in Mozambique. So one of these cyclones was the strongest to ever make landfall in Africa. This cyclone killed over 600 people and seriously affected 2 million. And now Mozambique faces extreme flooding, but it also faces extreme drought. And, you know, there's only so much that these vulnerable nations can do to adapt to extreme weather, because, as I said, they've already been ravaged by the forces of colonialism. And so, you know, we can already see mass displacement of people. So according to research conducted by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, in 2019 alone, 24.9 million people were displaced across 140 countries and territories. This is 3 times higher than displacements from conflict and from violence. And, you know, the places that people were most displaced were places such as Bangladesh, India, the Philippines. And this was a result of things such as monsoon rains, floods, tropical storms. And we know that this displacement will only get worse. But, you know, within the West, we have the privilege of not being confronted by it, you know, not starving to death because your crops won't harvest, not facing whole days without electricity because there's not enough rainfall to fill the dam, not battered by extreme weather which tears apart your surroundings, even though we live in a country that is responsible for this degradation.
Yeah. So I think for the next few parts, we're going to go through climate-related social movements, or, you know, social movements that have climate at the forefront of their fights, basically. So I'm going to start with a bit of a personal example, just in the sense that I've been working in Fairtrade since September. So I'm just going to talk about Fairtrade briefly. For those of you who've never heard of it, Fairtrade just basically is a movement for a more just and more equitable system of trade. We generally tend to fight for workers' rights, women's rights, and also, quite importantly, against climate change. And so I used to believe in, well, I still have sometimes doubts, but I used to believe at all about in fair trade, because I was worried about the global south to global north, you know, in quotation marks, trade relationship. I was wondering, you know, how can you be sure that producers are really paid fairly? How are you sure that it's really that it's not just monocultures? How are you sure that it's sustainable? Basically, how can you ensure ethical consumption within a capitalist system? And the thing with fair trade is that the entire premise of, you know, the concept is that we rely very strongly. Now we're starting to hear about north to north fair trade, but you know, it relies on producers in the global south producing goods that we transform and buy in the global north. And so there is inherently that unequal power dynamic going on. And so so, you know, I had doubts about fair trade, and concerning other arguments in fair trade, there were, like, concerning the ones specifically about climate change, is that we see a lot of responsibilization of consumers. And so people are often told, and I think some fair trade movements do this, you know, they kind of say, like, make sure to buy the Ben & Jerry's with the logo on it, make sure to buy the Kit Kat with the logo on it, as though, you know, what you consume and whether or not your light bulbs are energy savers is really going to counter the you know, the violence done to land and to people by these multinational corporations. And unfortunately, this discourse of responsibilization of consumers is something which is present in quite a lot of movements, and we're going to argue something a little bit provocative, I guess, which is the idea that basically I think a lot of these movements have been taken over by white people. And what I mean by that is that a lot of movements, so I spoke about fair trade, but here I think what I'm thinking about a lot is maybe like vegan movements, or movements who have really framed themselves as like taking a strong stance for veganism and for like civil consumption patterns changing, basically. So I think that a lot of these movements have this pattern of exclusion of non-white people and non-middle class plus people. And I think the easiest way to see that is the economic exclusion. So personally, when I think of vegan places, maybe this is a stereotype, I know it's more than just that, but when I think of something vegan, I think of expensive coffee shops in London. And, you know, of course, by essence, these are not accessible to everyone. But being vegan is also, you know, cooking plant-based meals, things like that. But I think even that is not necessarily accessible because, you know, it's very time consuming. So it's not necessarily easy. And also we see a lot of advocacy for veganism. And I think perhaps less now, but I think there was this trend of kind of ramming it down people's throats. But, you know, if you're a small scale farmer in the global south or in the global north, it doesn't matter, and you're killing animals for sustenance, for feeding your family, why should you be vegan at the end of the day if essentially you're not putting money in the pockets of massive corporations? So, you know, why would you be vegan? So, and also Lisa pointed out to me, and I think it's quite important, the fact that a lot of people around the world naturally have, not naturally, but just, you know, they have plant-based diets and they don't go around calling themselves vegan. So like, for example, in Southeast Asia or like in the West Indies, eating plant-based foods is very generalized. But because in the West we have coined, you know, this idea of veganism and we've determined it that way, this sounds extreme, but it's as though white people have invented eating fruit, which obviously we haven't. And I know it sounds extreme, but what I'm arguing is that we've taken over these movements, and our white supremacy is perpetuated because we're perpetuating the idea that white concepts and white worldviews and white forms of knowledge and knowledge production are more important than other forms of knowledge. And I'm just kind of putting this out there, and I'm going to go back to it later.
Yeah, so Esau has kind of been talking about the fact that, you know, as white people and as Western people, we believe that we are at the forefront of these movements. But I just want to give you like two fun facts which kind of work to discredit this. So Bangladesh was the first country to ban plastic bags in 2002. Rwanda was the first country to ban non-biodegradable plastic in 2008. But I remember in the UK when we banned plastic bags, you know, we all walked around with some like moral like high ground. So now I want to move on, and Esau just was talking about the whiteness within kind of the vegan movement within fair trade, and now I want to deconstruct two movements or two groups or two people rather. Basically, I want to deconstruct the whiteness in environmental movements and environmental groups. So I'm going to have two case studies. The first is going to be Extinction Rebellion, and the second one will be Greta Thunberg. So I'm sure we've all heard of Extinction Rebellion. You know, they've galvanized the public, and, you know, like essentially put climate change at the front of the public domain, you know, with their tactic of mass like civil disobedience. And if you don't know about Extinction Rebellion, they have 3 demands. So their first demand is that the government tells the truth and declares climate emergency. The second demand is that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. And the third demand is that we set up a climate assembly to deal with climate change, or climate justice, as they write. And I'm sure if you've heard about Extinction Rebellion, you've probably heard about them whitewashing the climate justice. And so, you know, we can talk about the prison guide, for example, that they released last year, which they have subsequently apologized for. But basically, it was a guide to actually to lay the foundations. Extinction Rebellion, one of their tactics is mass arrest. So this was a guide to kind of tell people what they should do when they get arrested. So, you know, talking about, you know, you can do yoga and meditation and order like a nice vegetarian meal whilst in prison, and that most prison officers are Black and do not wish to give you a hard time. And obviously, like, this is completely tone deaf, and they did, you know, take it down after, but just this carelessness highlights their just unacknowledgement of, you know, marginalized people, because obviously we know that within the UK, Black people are 10 times more likely to get stopped and searched by the police. We know that people, Black people have died in the hands of the police. And so, you know, this tactic of mass arrest just alienates ethnic minorities. And like personally, like I've been to a few Extinction Rebellion protests where, you know, whilst people get arrested, they shout, you know, we love you, police, we love you. And for me, I just found that shocking. Like, how can you love and sing praises of an institution that is undeniably racist? But also, you know, we can talk about their tactic of disruption. So, you know, within this civil disobedience, sometimes Extinction Rebellion will kind of stop rush hour traffic. And yes, this is good to kind of, you know, a lot of people are watching this and, you know, it makes people aware, but at the same time, it's at a detriment to who? At a detriment to people who are low income, and then so therefore, you know, disproportionately Black and brown people. And so again, I say that these tactics exclude marginalized people. And, you know, it's not the case that Extinction Rebellion, you know, actively are trying to marginalize these people. However, as I've said, you know, this carelessness just perpetuates this white power structure in which we live. And, you know, Extinction Rebellion have faced a lot of criticism, and, you know, there is some kind of acknowledgement of their privilege, and I think they are trying to make steps forward to be more inclusive of Black and brown people. However, I would argue that they are not doing enough. So before this seminar, I just went on the Extinction Rebellion website and I looked at their, like, the truth section. And so this section kind of details their demands, details kind of the climate emergency, what it is, details like an about us, and then it also has like an FAQ. So I just like went on this section and saw if they were writing anything which says that, you know, the global south and marginalized communities will be worse affected, and I could not find anything. They do have a section where they say it is important for, you know, people, like regardless of age, class, gender, race, to join the climate movement, but they're not putting anywhere out there on the main part of their page to explain this. And obviously they do have kind of like documents that they've released outside of this section of the page which do talk about this, but why is it not on their main the main section of their site? And I also want to ask Extinction Rebellion, why have you not followed the US Extinction Rebellion, who have added a fourth demand? So as I said earlier, Extinction Rebellion UK has 3 demands, but the US Extinction Rebellion went further to add another demand. And I'll just read out this demand. So it says, we demand a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and Indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and poor communities, for years of environmental injustice. So why have the UK, the UK Extinction Rebellion, they're the original Extinction Rebellion. Why have you not taken that step? And the fact that they are at the forefront overshadows groups such as Wretched of the Earth. So Wretched of the Earth is a UK climate justice group who put Black, Brown, Indigenous voices at the front. And last year they actually wrote an open letter to Extinction Rebellion, condemning these practices which alienate Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And to give you some context on Wretched of the Earth, in 2015, they were removed from the front of a climate march in London by the organisers, who cited their anti-colonial message as too political. And Wretched of the Earth last September delivered a speech as part of the global climate strike, where they said, "You've all heard that our house is on fire, but for many of us, our house has been on fire for over 500 years. And so that leads me nicely on to talking about Greta Thunberg. Basically, we probably most of us have heard of her because she's the face of the school climate strike. She now, attends and speaks at UN climate summits. And her influence is so great that the media have termed it the Greta Effect. And I want to argue that even this name, the Greta Effect, is perpetuating this white supremacist structure because it ignores and disregards, the work of other child activists who happen to be Black, Brown, and Indigenous. And so, there's so many that we can talk about. I just want to give a few names. So we can talk about 12-year-old African-American Mariko Penny, who was vocal in Flint's water contamination crisis. We can talk about Helena Gwilinga, an Indigenous activist from Ecuadorian Amazon, who often works with her aunt and her sister, who won WWF's Top Youth Conservation Award last year. We can talk about Leah Namugawa, a 15-year-old Ugandan activist, galvanizing youth support in relation to climate change. And, what we can say is that there is evidence that Greta Thunberg is becoming aware, or that she's aware of her privilege. So, for example, in December at a UN summit, she announced that she wasn't going to be speaking, and instead she gave the floor to Indigenous activists. However, still, Greta and Extinction Rebellion, the fact that they are at the forefront of, climate justice and the climate change movement, just reinforces the idea that we deem white faces, white stories, and white experiences as more important and more worthy of being listened to than Black faces, brown faces, Indigenous faces, and voices. Iso, you're muted, babes.
I know, I saw. Yeah, I think you're right. Those are very important words at the end there. So as Lisa just said, we're aware that there is deforestation going on. We're aware that there is extreme land extraction and land degradation. Yeah, somebody said, as Serena said, so well said. Exactly, I agree. So we know that, many species are threatened by extinction, the list goes on. So we're aware that we have to, put in place measures in order to, compensate climate change or to deal with climate change. So we have created something called conservationism. It's actually not something that we've created in response to climate change. It's something that's been going on for a while. But basically, long story short, conservationism is the protection of biodiversity. So often you can see it if you think of natural reserves, even safari parks, things like that. Those are parks that are where wildlife is supposedly protected. So I think all of us know WWF that Lisa just mentioned. They're very famous for their panda logo. It's the World Wildlife Fund. And so in national parks across Asia and Africa, WWF has been providing high-tech equipment, cash, and weapons to paramilitary forces who themselves have been accused of beating, torturing, sexually assaulting, and murdering many, many, many people. And so I'm just using WWF as an example, but they are not the only organization to do this. There are many, and this has happened like across the world. So I'm just going to use one more specific example where I'm going to go into more detail. So in Kenya, there is the Sengwer community. I apologize for my pronunciation. I've never heard it said. I don't know how you say it. But basically, the World Bank has launched a program called the Natural Resource Management Program in relation with the, they've created this program with the Kenyan government. And so the World Bank has given $64 million to the KFS, which is the Kenyan Forest Service, who themselves have been committing brutal mass evictions of those Sengwer people, for example, by torching their houses. So there was an investigation that was led, and at the end of the investigation, it was concluded that the World Bank had failed to follow, oh, Chelsea's here, sorry about that, that the World Bank had failed to follow crucial safeguard policies in order to protect Indigenous people. The panel nevertheless absolved the bank of any responsibility for the evictions being conducted by the government, by the very government agency it was funding to implement the scheme. So this is literally colonialism with immunity. And so these instances of evictions and forced displacements from ancestral lands, instances of moral, physical, or sexual violence, all of this constant criminalization of people, you know, for example, being arrested for trespassing on your ancestral land. This is something that, as I just said, is, you know, it's a worldwide problem, and it goes on at various levels. You know, it goes on global and local levels. So, you know, I gave an example in Kenya here, but it's also happened in Botswana. It's happened to the Maasai people in Kenya and in Tanzania. It's happened across Southeast Asia, for example, in Nepal, in India, etc. So, and it's also happened in settler nations, obviously, like Australia, Canada, and the United States, for example. So, as Lisa said, what we see is that all lives don't matter, and that Indigenous people all over the world are still suffering from the colonial relics. I want to call them relics, but I'm not even sure that they're really relics. But yeah, the colonial leftovers that we see in conservationism, amongst many other things. So we know that most of the carbon emissions come from what we call the first world or the global north. And we know that the greatest culprits are fossil fuel industries and banks who fund those fossil fuel industries. And those are almost exclusively always located in the West and owned by Westerners. I'm thinking of, you know, Credit Suisse, Swiss Credit, or JP Morgan Chase. And, you know, I think it's important to note that Indigenous-led protests, like, for example, in the United States, Standing Rock or against Keystone Pipeline, all of these protests have been against these big corporations and big banks, and they've been for the land. That is the aim of those protests. It's preservation of the land. So these conservationists are conserving, these organizations of conservation are conserving land, which is already defended, and they're conserving land and animals, but they're evicting and killing the people whose ancestral land it is. And I think it's important to note here that 80% of the world's biodiversity lies in Indigenous territories. So the fact that we feel the need to come in to Kenya and decide how we're going to conserve nature, or come into, you know, what we have called Indian country, or, you know, just come in and decide this is how we're going to do things, it's again perpetuating this white supremacist idea that we do things better. And so I do want to move away from the idea of the noble savage, and, you know, which is kind of the Western fantasy that Indigenous people are kind of at this pure state where they're like uncorrupted by capitalism. I don't think that's, I want to acknowledge and move away from that. However, I do think that there are numerous examples of either First Nations or just Indigenous people across the world who have proven, who, you know, have shown that they have because they have different relationships with their environments, they also happen to have more respectful relationships with the environment than our capitalist system. So I mentioned, oh, I don't know if I deleted that earlier, but yeah, for example, Northwestern people in the Pacific Northwestern people, used to fish enough salmon to feed their entire communities. You know, salmon is a staple of it's central in their belief system. But now with capitalist means of production and mass fishing, we see that these salmon are drying out. So as I said earlier, you know, it's not possible for indigenous traditions to be preserved while land degradation is going on. So there's this kind of double, well, it's one genocide, but it's genocide and ecocide going on at the same time. And so passing on your knowledge to your children is no, and, you know, therefore enabling the thriving of your community and the cultural well-being is no longer possible because you can't live in your land. So yeah, I think preservation of land and preservation of knowledge are really intrinsically linked, and violation of one is also violation of the other. I think, and you know, it also participates in the systematic genocide of indigenous peoples. So the thing with modernity, in quotes, and enlightenment, and, you know, rationality, or, you know, what we have created here in the West, comes from the idea that us Westerners, and by extension white people, are more rational, in quotes, more smart, in quotes, more capable, and, you know, than other people. And I think this is the very foundation of how we see the world. And we've seen that in the past when we sent missionaries to go abroad to convert people to our God because our God was better. We see it in settler nations when children were taken away from their families, up until 1996 in some places, to make them more white and to erase their culture. And we see it today, for example, in conservationism. You know, we feel the need that we need to save the forest when, as I said, 80% of biodiversity is protected within indigenous territories. So I want to end on the introduction of a concept which is epistemological violence. It's a bit of a scary word, it's a bit big, but basically epistemology is knowledge, and epistemologies are plural. And I've tried to explain that our system, because it's white supremacist, it has pushed us to see our knowledge as superior, as supremacy. So, but the thing is, and so in the past, in order to set up this white supremacy, we have erased, you know, names, people, languages, places, monuments, cultures, memory. We've erased all of this in order for our one and only thing to stand. So I would just like to end by highlighting the importance of indigenous people and indigenous knowledges in this fight. Obviously, I can only say so much because I'm not indigenous, so I don't really have, you know, I can't really give you much knowledge on that, but all I can say is really, I think we need to actively place these people at the forefront of the fight against climate change. And yeah, we need to listen, and we'll communicate resources later and try to give a bunch of information on things that people can look into that maybe can talk about it from a better perspective than me.
Yeah, so now I want to move the conversation on and talk about what we're doing to tackle climate change. So in the UK, last May, the UK government declared climate emergency after former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn tabled the motion. But what does this actually mean? So this doesn't really mean much because this is non-legally binding and there's no real clear definition set out to what is going to happen. But we do know that there is some plan to go carbon neutral by 2050. But this is actually 25 years after Extinction Rebellion's proposed 2025 plan. But obviously one of the ways in which we will get there is by transforming, you know, our reliance on fossil fuels to clean energy. And so now I kind of want to deconstruct clean energy and argue that it's not so clean as we think. So obviously, to build solar panels, to build wind turbines, to build batteries for the clean energy revolution, we need metals such as cobalt, lithium, and copper. And studies show that by 2050, copper demand will increase by 400%. So where are these metals going to come from? Well, they're going to be mined, but where are they going to be mined? And so the Democratic Republic of Congo holds the world's largest cobalt reserves, and Chile holds the world's largest lithium and copper reserves. We know that mining releases carbon emissions, depletes water resources, destroys local habitats, and contributes to deforestation. But we can also talk about the social injustices at play. You know, we've all heard of, you know, children working in mines within the Congo. We've all heard about, you know, the conflict within the Democratic Republic of Congo because of the mining industry. But I also want to talk about, you know, careless mining at the hands of the global north, which contaminates water resources and, you know, destroying the health of local communities and destroying the health of the miners. And so again, I want to give a story of Zambia because, as I said, I'm half Zambian. And so Zambia is one of the world's largest exporters of copper. So if you go to Zambia, they have like a copper belt province, and there's just loads and loads of copper mines. And a UK company called Vedanta, last year, a case was taken to the UK Supreme Court, actually, claiming that Vedanta was, you know, violating human rights, because this company was doing this careless mining that I'm talking about, and they were, you know, polluting the locals' water and polluting and ruining the health of the people. And this has been going on for years and years and years and years. And so, you know, we already have this exploitation at the hands, you know, of the West within the mining industry in the global South. So my argument is that this will only get worse, and, you know, unless we do away with, you know, the system of colonialism and exploitation that we have, which satisfies demand in the global North whilst harming the global South. Iso, babe, you're muted.
So yeah, as Lisa just said, the UK has announced they aim to have their carbon output at net zero by 2050, which is what the UK Official Committee on Climate Change recommended, but as Lisa said, not what Extinction Rebellion recommended. So in the last 30 decades, the UK's own carbon emissions have actually fallen by 40%. And in 2010, 75% of the UK's energy came from gas and fossil fuel industries. And now that is actually only 40% of, the UK energy is from fossil fuel industries. So this looks like quite a positive shift, but unfortunately there is an invisible side to this carbon footprint, which is the carbon footprint of all the imported goods that the UK relies on. So the carbon footprint of the actual process of manufacturing those goods and the footprint of the international travel remains in the country of export. So the UK it's basically just carbon dumping and placing the burden of those carbon units or carbon emissions on the manufacturing countries, which are disproportionately countries from the global South. So I'm going to talk about carbon credits for a moment, which is basically when a company cannot or doesn't want to adhere to carbon targets or carbon limits, they try to offset their carbon emissions. So they try to do green things. So either they can try to reduce their carbon emissions, or they can try to, I kind of want to say, distract the attention. So basically do green things in order to lower the overall emissions. So what they do is that they often fund, corporations and stuff often fund green movements, such as like movements for planting trees or investing in renewable energy, things like that. But carbon credits have actually been condemned by the UK Chief Scientist of Greenpeace and by the UK Committee on Climate Change. And this is the same committee which said that 2050 was a good aim to have your carbon, so they're not, you know, the most radical. So I think this is all really quite linked to conservationism. Once you tie conservationism with the idea of carbon credits, because you can really see how this can clearly be a form of colonialism, in the sense that the burden is transferred onto developing nations which have little to no carbon limits. And to give an example of that, the Oakland Institute published a report investigating carbon offsetting in Uganda. And so they realized that companies invest in conservations of forest in order to record their carbon emission reductions, basically. So in order to have kind of positive carbon emissions to some extent. if that makes sense. So what happens is that companies basically grab land, and as part of their carbon offset schemes, they plan to use that land for reforesting. So this disenfranchises local communities because it evicts them and it's land grabbing. But it also obviously restricts access to their land, so they no longer have access to food, water, firewood, etc. And it's insane because at the same time, this is a loophole for these corporations to meet their environmental targets. So this is the case of the Norwegian company Green Resources, but again, it's the case of many, many corporations. I think Total, the petrol corporation, also has systems in place like this to lower their carbon emissions. So, let's remain aware. And I'd like to move on to another argument, which is something that the chief climate advisor of WWF said, and it's an argument that is also present in Leonardo DiCaprio's documentary on climate change. I don't know if anyone has seen it, but it's basically the idea that it's basically getting countries inviting countries in the global south to move straight away to renewable energies, and to, it's kind of like, oh, this is an opportunity for poorer countries to build their own low carbon sectors, and, getting them to move to renewable energy immediately, as soon as possible. But I just think there's a strong irony here, because we got to our stage of late capitalism through exploitation of people and of land, and we know that that's the only way to get there. And so we portray ourselves as like, look, we're the ones presenting you with all these new ideas, like, oh, look, you can go into renewable energy, when I just think it's very ironic. And also within the same vein of like portraying ourselves as leaders of the climatic movement, I think the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is a good kind of example of someone portraying that, maybe not him as an individual, but just his government, they portray themselves as kind of the lord and saviors of climate justice and justice in general, when their very government has violated treaties that they've signed with Indigenous people like 150 years ago. They've trespassed onto Indigenous territories. They've violated human rights. They violated consent by placing pipelines that were never authorized. All of this at the same time, while still portraying themselves as the leaders on climate. And I think that also an important element to add in is the fact that we are going to see more immigration to the West with the increase of climate adversities. And so while I just think it's kind of important to remind ourselves that we have all these anti-immigration, this very strong anti-immigration sentiment across the West, but we are doing very little in our power. I mean, I don't know, it's just all of these what I'm trying to say here is that all of these things are very interrelated, and they're all part of one greater thing, which is white supremacy. This is it's all part of the same machine, And so what I'd like to end with is, again, the idea that knowledges are multiple, and that if we want anything to work, we have to kind of, I mean, it sounds like a hippie thing to say, but we kind of have to work all together. And I think I just want to introduce another idea, which is it's not a perfect idea, but I think it's worth mentioning, is the fact that the Bolivian government has created a universal declaration for the rights of Mother Earth, and the fact that Ecuador has included the rights of nature in their constitution. I just wanted to mention that because I think it's a good example of how of different forms of knowledge. Like, I don't think in my Western French or Irish culture, I don't think we would have thought about, first of all, we don't think about Mother Earth in those terms, but also we wouldn't think about necessarily giving human rights to an entity that we consider ourselves to be separate from. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is, let's embrace the multiplicity of knowledges, because I think we have a lot to learn. And again, the West is not leading this fight on climate change.
Yeah, so just the last point I want to cover is the point of reparations. And so this whole time we've been talking about the link between colonialism and climate change. And so if we are to acknowledge this link, then we have to acknowledge that there is a debt to pay to developing countries. So, you know, the global south has been ransacked of its resources and its economic stability. And now the West has, you know, sanctimoniously declared climate emergency, even though, you know, Black and brown people have been suffering for years and they've been fighting for years for this very thing. And this, you know, reminds me, or is similar to the fact that, you know, European Western powers started slavery, and then when they abolished slavery, they sanctimoniously, you know, declared themselves like morally upright. So we need like reparations for those nations that have been exploited and who are merely victims of climate change, so that they can combat disaster because they do not have the resources. And here I want to give a case study of Haiti. So Haiti is the poorest country within the Western Hemisphere. And so this is directly linked to the exploitation of the country. So I just want to give you some context on Haiti. So Haiti was the first and actually the only country to have a successful slave rebellion. And so after this revolution, after the slaves got into power, France demanded Haiti paid them reparations, you know, because the slaves, you know, killed the people and ruined their economic opportunism, or like ruins their economy by like ruining their slave culture. And so from, I think it was around the 1830s to 1947, Haiti paid France $21 billion in reparations. So this is, you know, absolutely ridiculous, you know. But now let me fast forward to 2010 and when the earthquake hit Haiti. So obviously, you know, Haiti was already vulnerable because it had just been exploited like economically by France for like this 100 years. It did not have the money, you know, for the resources to combat and to deal with this earthquake. And so at this time, you know, the Western powers, you know, sanctimoniously grouped together and said, let's help out Haiti. And they collectively gave $13 billion to Haiti. However, this is much less than the $21 billion that France alone, or that Haiti gave France alone. And so, you know, when we think of that situation, a lot of us tend to think, oh, you know, the West is helping this country, and it's almost, you know, reminiscent of this white savior complex. However, my argument is that, you know, it's the West's fault that this country has been exploited and is in this condition. So it's not like a help, this is not aid, this is what you owe them. You owe them that much and you owe them so much more. So we need to get rid of this white savior mentality that we have and realize that reparations are due. So as I said, you know, this is a great example of the white supremacist patriarchal power structure, you know, which caused socioeconomic deprivation to the global south and caused climate change. So to round up everything that we've been talking about in this seminar, you know, climate change is a result of colonialism, racism, neoliberalism. And we must acknowledging that by labeling climate change as like merely a technical phenomenon, you know, this is reductionist, because climate change is a social, economic, like political, cultural phenomenon. And we must acknowledge that climate change is not a thing of the future. It is already happening. It's already killing people. It's already displacing people. You know, being white and, you know, being Western, you have the privilege of not feeling it, of not being confronted by it. And so I just want to end my little section here and say that, and compare it to something I read in a book. So Aimé Césaire, in his book on colonialism, basically talks about the fact that Nazism, or like when Nazism was like played out in the Western world, you know, when Germany was committing these atrocities that they did, or the Nazis were committing these atrocities that they did, you know, this was nothing new. We can't be surprised at that, because this same practice, this same ideology that the Nazis had was just, you know, the ideology that was used within the global south, you know, within Africa, within the Americas, within Asia, to colonize people. And so it's only surprising because that ideology was then used on European people. And it's the same thing with climate change. Like, you know, some of us are surprised, like, where did this climate change come from? Like, oh, it just came out of thin air. No, this, you know, this ideology of colonialism has been played out for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's been affecting Black, Brown, Indigenous people for hundreds of years. It didn't just, you know, fall from the sky. We need to acknowledge this. We need to acknowledge this structure that has been created at the hands of, again, the white patriarchal power structure in which we live.
Yeah, 100%. I think acknowledging white supremacy and, as Van Jones coined it, the unbearable whiteness of green is so important. And, you know, talking about environmental racism on local and much greater levels is really, really important, because white supremacy is just the entire structure, and, you know, vulnerability as we've defined it is kind of, you know, it's at the center, and then war, peace, gender, race, poverty, class, etc. These are all the variables which will influence your exposure and your risk and your capacity to recover from it long-term, short-term, or long-term. And, you know, I think Lewis Gordon he's an African-American thinker, and he's put forward the idea that, is white privilege even the right framework to talk about these things? Because is clean water not just a right? Is it really like, you know, and so basically what he argues is that by talking about white privilege, are we not lowering what is acceptable for people of color to go through? Which I think is an important just kind of point. But also, I think there are positive things that we can take out of these movements that we've argued have been taken over by white people, like Fairtrade or Extinction Rebellion or veganism or whatever. But it's important to remain critical of these movements, and to remember that we live in a fundamentally capitalist, white supremacist system, and that everything is related, and the treaties that were signed 150 years ago are still legally binding, and that if you want things to change, you have to take down capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and coloniality in all its forms. Coloniality of power, of land, of being, of knowledge, of everything, because all of these things work together and sustain each other. And, you know, we believe it's the only way, and, you know, we're not the only ones that believe this. We'll try to send you all our resources.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's the end of our presentation. So now we want to open up the discussion. So anybody that has thoughts, comments, questions, everything's welcome.
Just like to say thank you so much for everyone, because we don't know a lot of people, so this is really, really cool. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. And I just say, you know, we're not scientists, we're more like approaching this from like a social justice level, but please feel free to give us, you know, any information you have. Yeah, but thank you as well for coming. And if you want to ask questions in the comments as well, feel free.
I see Beck, you'd like to say something, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, my name is Nonti. I'm originally from South Africa, and I'm currently in Spain. And wow, thank you for this time and space. I've lived in eco-village for about 6 years. I've been involved in the eco-village movement, specifically in Europe. And gosh, it's like I want to take you with you and put it in my bag, because you know, like the eco-village movement in Europe is a very wide space, and it's been really almost like my journey to bring this message of having white friends who feel very strong that they're really doing something positive towards climate change, and yet not understanding anything about what's happening really in the global south. You know, and I just want to emphasize on that. Like, I just feel my stomach kind of rumbling, that it's always a talk about what's coming. So it's almost like we are doing something from the planet, yet it's been done from the Eurocentric point of view, forgetting that there's other people who live in this planet who are actually have already been suffering from the crisis. We're not talking about 10 years, we're talking about this 500 years of colonization, So I think there's we need more people like you who come and tell these stories, who come and give this education to the social movements. I'm currently working with Dr. Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility. And for me, it's like I'm always just trying to push it to say, we also need to talk about the climate, the social movements, the young white European change makers who are really, I see the love and the passion, but unfortunately, there's a very strong ignorance. There's this, we need to name it so we can heal it, because if we don't name it, it cannot be healed. So therefore we need to say white supremacy. We cannot escape it. It's there, it's in the system. So therefore we need to start talking openly and having dialogues like this and having educational spaces like this, so we can start to heal and unite and really understand that it is not a white man's world. It is our world, and we are together in this, and we really need to find ways to create sacred spaces of safe communication and doing this work together. And so for me, it's such a pleasure to just listen to you and the work that you're doing. And as I said, when I joined the Eco-Village movement, I thought, wow, I found the people who get it. But after a few years, I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, we still have a long way to go. So, and then the second point I wanted to know is, are you going to share the link to this recording?
Yeah.
And how can we find it?
So we have pages on Instagram and Facebook, and we've shared our previous seminars on our page, right?
On Facebook, and we also have a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll share it on Facebook, YouTube, but also post a link on our Instagram as well.
Yeah.
And our username is just whiteness with an X instead of an I. But thank you so much for sharing. I completely agree with everything you said.
If anyone else has anything to say, please share.
Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
I didn't want to go second because I'm from South Africa, and because Nonti is also from South Africa, I was thinking, why would the South Africans be talking alone here? But the topic is so close, near and dear to our hearts because of our colonial history and how it's impacted our country, and how we still struggle with a lot of the colonial roots that was anchored in our country, and we still struggle from that. I mean, if you want to bring it very closely to home, you will see in our country that our apartheid spatial planning has been of such a nature that Black and brown people live close to dump sites and polluted areas. So from a green perspective, we are the least in society, and there need to be some justice around that. For example, fishing has become a problem now, and yet corporations have been exploiting that route for so long. And now a man that literally lives by the sea and who lives from the sea are needing to seek permits while the corporates fish freely in the sea. So those type of things need to be addressed. But I also have to say it's quite refreshing to see a white person, and not to say more about white people versus us people addressing the issues that we deal with daily. But it's good to hear from a white voice the understanding of knowing that the Eurocentric understanding of things is not superior, that we have brilliant academics. We don't just wear loincloths and chase animals all day. We have brilliant academics, and we produce brilliant knowledge. But we are up against this idea of the Western influence being the superior way to go. So I hopefully things like this and more people coming together and speaking on issues related to this. I'm also a colleague and friend, mentor, and I work with Robin DiAngelo down here on race and racism, white privilege, white supremacy, things like that. But also on decolonizing our education system, because Lord knows it's been 600 years and we're still learning about white people. And like black people has never done anything right. And that type of thing we are hoping to change some point in our lifetimes and not in the next. So a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think this gives me some hope that we are moving towards a new tomorrow. And I think if you remember, for some of you, it was the global world that came together to ultimately force the white government in South Africa to release Nelson Mandela. So if a global group like this can come together and make enough noise, maybe we can defeat white supremacy once and for all, institutionally as well as individually. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope we can defeat it as well. Anybody else? Hello.
Yeah. Hi guys.
Hi.
So yeah, I am part of Extinction Rebellion and on the diversity inclusion working group in Brighton. And yeah, this last year has been a real journey for me in terms of, I don't know, just learning a lot about privilege and race and everything. And so, yeah, following the October Rebellion is when we sort of, as a university group, the University of Sussex, started to focus more on climate justice and like kind of we were seeing all the criticisms about like how white XR is, and I don't know, it just was suddenly hitting me in the face. And so yeah, now I'm a part of this group, but I'm kind of honestly thinking about shifting away from XR as a whole, because I don't know if it can be transformed from the inside to make it a more accessible place, or if it's just, you know, if I need to join a movement which has climate justice and people of color more at the center, like from the beginning. So I don't know, I was wondering what were all of your opinions about that, and should I stay as part of the working group, and do you have any recommendations for me, or should I quit XR and do something else?
I guess just sorry.
I actually went to the University of Sussex, and so there are a number of associations that you can join. I'm thinking namely of Decolonize Sussex, which is, I'll write it in the chat, called Decolonize Sussex. And
yeah, I love Decolonize Sussex.
So I was just going to say, you know, there are, anyway, well, I was just going to say that. So what were you going to say, Lisa?
I was just going to say, I guess the great thing about Extinction Rebellion is the fact that they have galvanized so much public support. And so obviously, ideally, this massive platform, you know, which permeates like different nations, it would be great for people to kind of spread the message within it, because unfortunately, like, you know, other climate groups, for example, I said Wretched of the Earth, but even, you know, like Black Lives Matter UK have staged like climate protests, and unfortunately these just don't get the gravity. So I don't know, I would say try and stay within, and, you know, join other climate groups, you know, as Isolde said, join like, or you've already joined like the Decolonize Sussex Society. So I would say, you know, find other groups, but I think it's important to try and change this big structure, because I do think, like as you said, I do think with all of the criticism that Extinction Rebellion have had, I do think they are consciously trying, but they're just not there yet.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, that it's sort of kind of like a catch-22, that white people and voices are privileged and listened to, like Greta and XR. So yeah, you know what I mean, that if we're going to have movements that are led by Indigenous and people of color, that, you know, the global media is just going to ignore them because that's what they do. So what's the solution there? Like, it's really tricky.
I don't know. I think I always, as a white person, I always say, I know it's very intangible, but if you listen and, you know, if you read and you listen and you learn and you unlearn, you're making such a step forward. It's more than us, you know, our white peers. You know, I mean, like, I'm not saying in any way, you know, I just think if you listen and you spread words of those marginalized people, I just think it's a step forward, you know. I know it's not necessarily very tangible, but I just think it's the start of a conversation, even within like our own families. Like, Lord knows my family is so sick about hearing about race, but like I always bring it onto the table because we're a white family and we can flow through life without ever having to think about it. So they'll die sick of it, but you know, it's less than what we have imposed upon other people. So yeah. And also people are proposing things and resources for you in the comments also.
And I would like to add, Laura, that as was mentioned now, we often say everything that a lot of people, for example, Robin DiAngelo, some of the things that they do, and people like us speak on, we say the same things, but our word doesn't carry the same strength as when a white person says it. It's almost like it's literally, I mean, it frustrates me to the moon and back when I can sit here and tell you now that if you're thirsty, have water, and you'll be all nonchalant. But if a white person come and say, oh, you're thirsty, have some water, and it would be groundbreaking. So that type of nonsense, we literally over that. But what can help us as people of color, when we do bring forward these very critical conversations, is when white people support us in those roles and not take over the role. It's very important. Understand the space that you are operating in and don't over exert your whiteness in that space. And that's something that DiAngelo mentions about white people being less white. And when you understand that process, you become the supporting actor in this initiative from Black people to try and take back what is mostly ours to begin with, but has been taken away from white people. So I like that you are, a lot of my white friends that I have, and that's how I kind of measure people, is not necessarily what they do when we are in community, but what you do when you're at home, when you're at a party and people use derogatory language or disrespectful or racist language, then it becomes important what white people do, not necessarily when we're in big groups and in the limelight, like the Greta Thunberg that has garnered so much global publicity. And as mentioned earlier, we have our own African brothers and sisters that have done similar work on a similar scale. So that's also decolonizing our media and all those platforms that allows us to engage with more people. So yeah.
Any other comments, guys? Don't feel shy.
Hello. Oh, was that someone else speaking?
Oh.
No, I think it was just me.
I don't know, you go ahead, Gal.
Okay. Hi, I'm Clara. Yeah, I think I'm glad that Laura kind of said how she felt, because for me, like, I've only really come across like truly understood racism and sort of like the race inequalities through actually working in the environmental sector in Bristol, and since kind of like, and through the conversations that they have around, yeah, climate justice and environmental inequality. And I feel the same in that, like, I feel like my passion now is not really for the environment. Like, obviously I do want to protect the environment, but it's really like people. And yeah, I just it's just nice to hear that someone else is sort of feeling that, like wanting to really get to the root cause of things, and it's not necessarily, but you made a really good point, Lisa, about we do need people, I guess, within these areas to like inform and spread awareness. I think I find that being Chinese, potentially like my message doesn't seem to carry as much or as far, I guess. So it's feels a bit like I'm in a tough or a hard place really with that.
Yeah, but I feel like just the fact that you're trying, you know, even if people don't want to listen, even if people are blocking their ears, you know, it's the effort, it's trying to kind of admonish and change this structure that we live in. And, you know, for example, people are going to get things wrong, like, you know, especially to white people, like you may get something wrong, you may, you know, need somebody to correct you at one point, but just the fact that you're trying, but just, you know, making sure like you're not kind of taking like prominence and speaking over other people, but yeah, so I just think just trying in any sense, like whoever you are, like is just one step forward.
Cool. Actually, a friend of mine mentioned that how she viewed environmental movements like XR as being quite colonial, in the sense that it's because it's like majority like white middle class people coming together and sort of like telling people what to do, like the movement sort of just saying like you should like kind of live this way. Would you go as far as saying that that's quite colonial, that kind of like concept of this movement like coming together and having these demands?
I mean, I would definitely say that, yeah, it perpetuates this colonial structure. It perpetuates this white supremacist structure. And, you know, you could go as far as to say that it is racist. But, you know, obviously when we use the term racism, we often think of, you know, people consciously out there trying to hurt black and brown people, you know, beating up black and brown people in the street, you know, burning crosses, running around like wearing white hoods. But that's obviously not the case. Like racism is a system. And so, yeah, I would go as far as to say that that is, you know, perpetuating this racist kind of discourse, but not, you know, racism as a lot of us think about it within our context. Yeah.
Also have mentioned Robin DiAngelo, and I think her work on white fragility is actually we could really harness it when we talk about climate change, because we white people are very fragile to first of all being called white, and also to when we have no problem calling someone else black, but also we're very fragile to, you know, when someone calls us white, we're very sensitive to being called white and to being called racist, but not because we don't like racism, but rather because we don't want people to think of us as racists. And I think that I can't remember where I'm going with this, but yeah, just basically the concepts of white fragility are really like, you know, it's challenging, but they're concepts, you know, the concept of whiteness and our reactions to our own whiteness is really important in this conversation on how, what I wanted to say was that a lot of our racist patterns are really, and biased patterns are really completely subconscious. And I think, you know, every single time that I've done racist things in my life, I haven't intended to harm anyone, but that is exactly the source of the issue, is that we need to be open to these criticisms, because we again, as I've said throughout the seminar, we need to learn from people who aren't like white cis straight males, you know. So yeah, I'm kind of just saying stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much space, but what just came up to my mind also was the realization of the mental illness that comes from, that is produced from Black and brown people trying so hard in social movements to have their voices heard. Because people liberals, as Robin says, and white people in social movements, they truly believe that they are the good people. They are not the right-wing fascists. So therefore, how dare you pinpoint racism? So therefore, it's almost like, well, you the troublemaker, and then you need to go. So it's a sense of also, it's something that I'm really researching and looking at, that I think we need to speak more about how, when as a brown person, when you're in white spaces, when you speak out, how you get affected and what happens, what are the consequences of you doing that, and the mental illness that comes with that. And that eventually causes us to feel like we need to leave this movement and start just strictly only Black and brown environmental movements, which I don't think this is the ultimate idea. The idea is for us to unite and work together as a human species. But we end up feeling like we need to go start Black and brown movements because we are not being heard and understood. And this is costing us our mental health.
So Lisa, one thing I wanted to pick up on was, I thought it was really well researched. One of the things you said was about how green technologies, like the movement to be more green, isn't that sustainable, isn't really that green. And you cite examples like mineral and cobalt mining in the Congo to help create solar panels. Can I ask you, if it isn't sustainable for, let's say, African nations to meet or emulate these standards, which, as you say, are set by white cultures and so on, would you accept if there was like a compromise? So these nations instead, in order to meet their energy needs, their demands, turn to things like coal or oil or fossil fuels, which is, these are sources of energy that developed nations are turning away from, but perhaps it could be something that African countries could use instead. How would you feel about squaring that circle, if you will, in terms of trying to be green, but at the same time trying to acknowledge that there are some fundamental inequalities in terms of how energy can be sourced? Thanks.
Yeah, so in your kind of the second part of your question, you talk about should developing countries go to like coal and gas. I mean, in the whole question, I just want to like highlight that it's not necessarily going to be any better. Okay, I might be saying something radical now, but I think that all of this kind of environmental degradation and this inequality is going to persist, and there's no real answer to it all. And so, obviously, when I was talking about green energy or renewable energy that's not so clean, it draws up the question, so what can we do? Like, what energy can we do? Like, where should we go? Like, in your question, do we let these developing nations go to, coal and fossil fuels? However, I would argue that the only real way to kind of destroy this inequality and to sort out like this climate justice issue is to destroy capitalism. And I know that sounds like pretty radical or, whatever, but capitalism is the system that, it means that some people are over consuming and people are also, exploiting people. So this exploitation is going to continue, whether, the energy is clean or unclean. It's still going to be exploitation, that we're still going to have this like colonialist ideology, because, the world is governed by this West capitalist ideology that we have. And so I honestly don't think that there's going to be real change. I don't think that there's going to be a real answer to the climate justice issue without destroying capitalism. I don't know if that answers your question. But...
No, it's fine. I just wanted your opinion. Thank you.
We have another question here, which I think is somewhat related, which is, oh wait, I've lost it. Wait, let me find it again. It is, Can you go into more depth about how colonialism throughout history has created the problem of climate injustice over the last few hundred years? Sorry for not having my audio and video on. Would you like to answer?
Yeah, I can answer. So we talked about this, like I talked about this in the first section, so I'll kind of just repeat what I say, but hopefully more concisely. So colonialism and like the system that we live was kind of constructed through so the system that we live was constructed through like colonialism and constructed through slavery. And the world order that we have now was started by Western people, European settlers, going to America and basically decimating populations, decimating like the land, decimating like animal populations as well, in order to satisfy them and in order to build their towns, build their cities, build their economy. And so what we have and what we need to think about is the doctrine, the capitalist doctrine that's within all of this is basically the idea that we can do whatever we want because we're chosen people by God. So we can kill everybody, we can ruin the whole like environment of a place just because money is going in our pocket. That's all we care about. We just care about that money. And so this kind of ideology was the ideology that started kind of this capitalist structure that we know, started the environmental degradation that we know. Therefore, colonialism is intrinsically linked to environmental degradation because it's lack of regard, it's dominion over these people, lack of regard of the environment, believing that you are number one, you are the model of everything and you can do what you like because it's satisfying your interests. And so is that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in just the thoughts of I went to a conference on colonialism and climate change in October, and there was two Navajo people, including one who's the head of an organization called Divest, Invest, Protect. If anyone's interested, I think she does really good work. She's a lawyer. Anyway, and so the man that she was with brought up the idea that basically there was a Q&A going on, and there was this French man who said, oh, but all of climate change is rooted in the Industrial Revolution. And this man spoke up and he answered, no, it's not rooted in the Industrial Revolution. The patterns of thought which enabled the Industrial Revolution to happen were going on way before that. And so what Lisa was talking about there, and this idea that us Westerners are more rational, are, we're superior to other people, but also we're separate to nature, and we can impose our dominion onto it. All of these ideas feed into the rationales that were developed through the Enlightenment years. And I think in that particular case, he was saying that those patterns of that rationale enabled the development of patterns of behavior that we then, in his particular situation, he was saying that we then brought over to what we now call the United States and Canada, and brought further and further west through manifest destiny. All of these things are related. The idea that we're the chosen ones, the idea that we can dominate nature if we want to, the idea that we can dominate and enslave Black people if we want to. All of this is so related. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's so helpful and informative. Thank you, guys.
If I just wanted to add something to that. If you look at, for example, our African histories, we were people who were living here, living off the land, and we weren't taking too much of nature, but living according to nature's ability to give. And only when the white colonialist came to our shores and discovered that we were rich in certain minerals, they started over extracting from those resources to the point where they started growing richer, bigger, and stronger. And the cycle of capitalism was then we had to mine the stuff, send it to the West, and then had to buy it back at a high premium, which at the end of the day left us in the position where most of our African countries are, where our economies are much poorer than our Western counterparts. And as Lisa mentioned on paying almost like reparations to our colonialists, that still lives in Africa. We still have to pay them money. They still dump their waste in Africa, ships of waste from the West being shipped off to our shores and being dumped here. So their old clothes and things like that. So when do we move from charity to justice for what has been done in the past under colonialism? So if you hear that, I mean, that is the process that was basically used in Africa to extract our resources for Western superiority. And that's how over this time from colonialism until today, I mean, Trevor Noah, who was a South African comedian, he made the joke that athletes at the London Olympics was running for the gold that was stolen from Africa, and now they're giving it back in medals. So you have to go and become an athlete to get anything back. So, so that type of idea that most of the wealth that is held by the West was extracted from, a lot was extracted from us, African countries, and yet we're the ones now suffering and being held accountable for climate change and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'd even add, concerning what you were saying just there, when the British abolished slavery, okay, I actually can't remember if they did this for all of the slave islands that they colonized, or if maybe it was just Jamaica. I'm not sure. Don't quote me, but there's a David Aluska documentary which I can send, which is where I got this from. But when the British abolished slavery, they knew that they were going to lose, in the same way as what the French did in Haiti, what Lisa was talking about earlier. They knew that they were going to lose a certain amount of money that they could have won, that they could have earned had they not abolished slavery. So they asked, so they compensated the slave owners with money that I can't remember the numbers now, but it was literally billions. And those slave owners left Jamaica, St. Lucia, etc., and they moved back to London. And in London, they built everything that we know now: all the big banks, all the railway companies, all the insurance companies, all the statues to the glory of such and such slave owner. And I think all, it's all related,
Yeah, we have some questions in the chat. So somebody asks, is it safe to say that the Industrial Revolution is what got us here with regards to climate change? So we can say the Industrial Revolution, as we said earlier, is very important, because obviously that was the time where greenhouse gas emissions literally just started rising exponentially. But again, I want to bring it back to colonialism and say what I said at the beginning of this presentation, which was there'd be no Industrial Revolution without this colonial ideology of dominion over land and people. There would be no Industrial Revolution without subjugating Black people and decimating lands. There'd be no textile industry without Black people picking cotton and on thieved land. So yes, we can say that the Industrial Revolution is definitely a period which it shot up, but we have to acknowledge that the ideology and the practice, the mentality that birthed that was the colonial mentality. So we need to bring it back to the beginning of colonialism.
And then there's another question also, which is, have you ever come across work that reimagines colonialism from the perspective of first people of any land in historical record? I don't think I have.
No, if you have any more information on that.
Yeah, I don't know any. If anybody else wants to speak up, the only thing I know is one book, which I can't remember the name, but I can try to find it. It switches the global north and the global south, but I don't want to recommend it because I never finished it, so I don't know how good it is. But if anybody else has any suggestions, feel free to speak up or post them in the comments. Oh, and here, the compensation that was paid to Caribbean planters had to be loaned by Britain to meet its cost, and that loan was being paid off until 2015. So actually, the descendants of this enslaved people have been paying this debt. This is interesting, relating to what I was saying, I think.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Of course.
So I wanted to thank you very much and to congratulate you with your work. It's really amazing to hear and how you put together information, and a lot of things really resonated with me, and a lot of things I, in bits and pieces, discussed in different groups, and now it came all together in such an informative way, and many things were also new for me. So really congratulations. And I guess I want to ask, or maybe just to think out loud, I'm thinking a lot, maybe because of my own background, about intersectionality in movements, also in environmental movements. And one of the things I think about is connected to position of white people not from global north. Like, for example, I just want to give example of my friends from Ukraine who of course, yeah, they came to the Netherlands, and of course they gained white privilege here, but on the other hand, they went through refugee camps to be able to gain the papers and to be able to stay here and like grow 2 children without, you know, having status, like being illegal. And I noticed, like, I mean, I'm from Russia myself, so I have, I'm surrounded also living in Europe, living in the Netherlands by Russian-speaking environment. And I'm myself allied with community, with queer community, mostly centered around people of color. But I noticed that for my, like, let's say, Russian-speaking friends or groups, it's difficult to find their place there because they don't really see their position in this discussion between global south and global north. And I have a similar example with people from other former Soviet countries like Tajikistan, who are like, you know, it's like fourth world country. And when a person is coming to Europe, of course, it's just a white male, cis male, but on the other hand, the background of a person is just growing up during war and not having anything. So I guess that's something I think about, but I don't have also any solution for myself. I also feel like a lot of people, like white people from these territories, they would kind of try to look up to white European people, which I find often a pity. And actually, Nonti invited me to this event. And we met in Russia also on one environmental event where actually this was very visible and we were talking about it. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about it? This is something that is on my mind and I wanted to share and just hear from you.
Yeah, I think this is the type of thing that shows kind of, at the end of the day, the absurdity of race, really, how like plastic it is and how it's changed so much through space, through time, like, you know, it kind of shows that. I think, yeah, I think one, it shows the absurdity. I think also maybe you might find it helpful if you look into the idea of being white passing, which is not the case. I mean, if you're from Ukraine, chances are you're not white passing, you're just white, but and you're given white privilege. But I totally understand what you mean in that, especially, I don't know about the Netherlands, but definitely in the UK, I used to live with a Romanian guy, and he would always say to me, like, I don't feel like I'm treated like a white British. And while I think that is very real, I still I think, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone's experience, but I think that because white supremacy is structured in the way that it is, we're still given a privilege that other people don't, even if our, you know, our lives have been hard and we've been through refugee camps and stuff like that. It's still, we're given that benefit of the doubt, and yeah.
So
I think it's complex.
I don't say that I don't have white privilege or any of the people I mentioned. So definitely, I definitely do. And actually, I experienced so much that I have white privilege being in the Netherlands, like really. I really learned actually what white privilege is after moving here. And also on my own experience. So I guess it is more what I was trying to say, that I feel like it is difficult for people to find their space in the maybe just a position of global north and global south. And actually it was very interesting when we were with Nonti on this event. It was in the far north of Russia, and this is the area where ecological collapse is happening right now. Because of the climate change. And when Nonti was saying global north and it was translated to Russian, people were just not understanding what does it mean, because in their opinion, this is global north where they are, where they're experiencing collapse. So it is, I guess I don't know what I'm trying to say, but these are just my thoughts, and I guess I have some kind of confusion about it, and that's something I'm thinking about right now. So, yes. So basically, I would like, I think why I'm saying this, I would like people, for example, from Russia or like other people in my environment to actually look up less to white European people and to see more about what is around. And so, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't actually think I can know. I don't know how much I can add really as a Western European person, but it's definitely interesting food for thought, I think. And if anyone else has anything to add, please feel free.
Yeah. So white supremacy as a way of reinventing itself based on the needs that they see as imminent right now. So as white people move around, and for example, with us, and I use South Africa as the reference, when apartheid, which was the dominant system of white supremacy in South Africa, was abolished, white people then transitioned and created a new system, almost of a subtle supremacy, but still floats under the institutional enforcement and policies that would still maintain white superiority throughout society. So it always reinvents itself. So for example, even I was living in London for a while. So in London, even if you come as a foreigner to London, being white, you still get like, you mentioned, the benefit of the doubt because you're white. But once you are established as a foreigner, then your privileges are limited to a certain extent. So for example, you're better than black people, but you're not exactly as good as the top white people in society that speak like the queen. So it's that levels that they operate in. And honestly speaking, it's news to me that a lot of Russians look to the West, because in my experience and within my understanding of our political systems, Russia is a close friend and ally to a lot of the African South, the global South. So I would think that within that relationship, Russia is almost more superior in with the South, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I hope that gives you some idea.
Thank you for bringing this up. Actually, you are right. There is a bit more complexity to what I was saying. I guess I was just referring to particular environmental movement in Russia and not in general. But they're different layers. It's very complex. So sometimes I don't know how to put it together myself.
But so thank you very much for bringing this up. Actually, it is very helpful.
Any other input from anybody?
There's something in the comments. There's some stuff in the comments. So I'm going to read one, which is from Wet. So it's, sorry, I'm not using audio, but I just wanted to say, having come from the same place as Lisa, I know we grew up with different experiences. And I have always believed myself to keep myself knowledgeable. I also wanted to talk about my personal experience and my Buddhist belief, with it being turned into a Western image. So with the Sanghas that I have joined in the UK, I don't know what the Sanghas are. With the Sanghas that I have joined in the UK, it is heavy in showing white Westerners as the front runners. So I think that the idea also runs through all subjects. As you said, white privilege is wired into society and is difficult to get out of, or to get it out of it. Like previously said, some things are done in an unconscious way. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, in the time that I was living in London last year, I used to go to like the local East London Buddhist centre for a little time, and it was interesting because one of my flatmates was half Indonesian, and she was saying to me, you know, like, you Westerners think that, you know, Buddhism is just like this West, or Buddhism is just kind of this Western thing, or you do it in a certain way, but the way that it's actually done, you know, within Indonesia is very different. And after I like came back from some like sessions, she basically was just, yeah, we basically just had a conversation about the whitewashing within Buddhism within the UK, and how it kind of undermines the actual way to do it, or like the way that it was originally like practiced. And also, you know, in a sense, like for example, like the Hare Krishnas as well within the UK, it's very much taken over by white people. We can see it being perpetuated or like reproduced by white people, and then, you know, misconstruing the message, you know, like as we said, Isolde said earlier with veganism, you know, Rastafari people, like Hindus were vegans before white people like came up with a name for it. And there is, you know, as you said, like there is this this trend, or this propensity to bog everything down to whiteness, to put whiteness like as a banner in front of like all movements and just, you know, all institutions, all systems, just life. You know, white is at the forefront and everything else is just like one step behind.
Yeah, we have another comment, which is concerning what we were talking about earlier regarding the Caribbean, well, like the, what's the word? Basically charging Caribbean islands for abolishing slavery, if I'm trying to sum it up. So basically the book, the book To Shoot Hard Labor, The Life and Times of Samuel Smith, an Antiguan working man from 1877 to 1982, is a must-read to understand that we do not call people who were taken from Africa slave because that objectifies them from the perspective of colonialism. At best, we can call such people, enslaved people. Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics also explores this, and a more great depth, Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics also explores this and more at great depth. Also, using an enslaved person reminds us all that there was an active protagonist. That's an interesting point, which is the slaver, whose own mental character must be very suspect if they could commit such acts of continuous violence against the earth and her people and still try to justify it and never apologize for it. Those are some very good points that are raised, and the resources that are given here in the chat we'll all put into our resource doc, which we'll share with the recording of the video. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. If there's no more questions, then perhaps it's time to call an end, but everything's welcome.
Just before you guys go, because I wanted to ask one question. I know we're talking about environmental racism tonight. I just wanted to know if there is space to speak about anything else with relation to racism that is currently headlining the news all over the world. Would that be fine?
Of course, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
We held other seminars on more specific topics, but I think in the discussion it's always gone into all directions.
Yeah.
So I think all of you saw the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota by the white police officer. And a lot of the conversation amongst people that I work with and people who are more progressive in trying to address the issue of racism, there's almost like an outcry today and over the last 2 days, also with the Cooper case, the lady calling in for the police when she was asked to lease her dog and then to use, for example, what I wanted to speak on is the fact that instead of Black people having a weapon, Blackness is a weapon for an opportunity to be killed. So it doesn't necessarily, we don't have to go out with knives anymore or guns because the color of our skin is weapon enough for us to die without committing any crimes. And as this is to some extent a global platform that we are speaking on, how do we enhance the voice to shout louder that Black lives matter, that it actually is more than it is currently given value to within the US specifically, but we do know that we struggle with racism across the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the big question. How do we move forward? Because, you know, it's not that these police killings are anything new. It's just that they're now being recorded and broadcast to everybody. And, you know, this system has been going on for a long time. Like, I want to draw attention to something that's, so basically I met Isol in France and we did an exchange year together at a university. And we both did this course entitled The African American Odyssey. And our professor, Sylvie Laurent, basically said that she wanted to call it Odyssey and not Journey, because Journey suggests that we've gone somewhere, that things have changed. But Odyssey, you know, she used the term Odyssey because she believes that, you know, all of this time, you know, through we've had slavery. You could argue, you know, that slavery is just now been molded into the prison system. It's not necessarily like that so much has changed. It's just that things have transformed into different kind of, with different guises. And so there is a question, like, what do? We need to stop this, you know, racist oppression. And I think that's why it's so important, you know, for us to have a discussion, you know, white people and Black people and, you know, brown people and everybody to have this discussion, because I feel like the only way we can change things is if everybody understands and acknowledges. You know, we need to have like a revolution of consciousness, and we need the people who are in power, the people that are going to get listened to more, to, you know, to actively admonish this system. And so, you know, if you're not actively like admonishing it, and if you're not working to destroy it, then you are complicit in it. And I think that's like something very important. Yeah, it depends, you know, how far do we have to go? Like, do we have to tear down the structure of capitalism to have an equal society? I mean, we all have different perspectives on things, but I would argue that perhaps that is the way to combat things. Obviously, again, like, sorry for being radical, but I do think, you know, inequality is natural within a capitalist system. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I just want to read some comments that have been written. So, one sec. Going back to climate, Mama D wrote, "It is also good to understand complicity within green organizations and how they appropriate epistemologies of the South in order to validate their positions in decision-making and to repress global Southerners from having a more critical input in into what is termed green politics." I think this is interesting. And yeah, thank you for your comments too. I agree. They've been very informative. And then there's something else, which is, there was something that I saw online. Sorry, I don't remember the original person who said it, but they were pointing out that murders like this one have been happening for centuries. It's only because we have the camera and phones that, on us all the time that now we're seeing it. But I even wonder if people want to fully acknowledge it. It does not need to be acknowledged. It does not need to be acknowledged. Well, yeah, I agree in the sense that, like, and Lisa, I don't think you should apologize for being.
Yeah, I take back my apology. I'm not apologizing. I'm gonna be radical.
Yeah, and yeah, this whole thing of like posting it on social media, I think it's or like the fact that it's being filmed and stuff, I think it's very worrying that we white people as a collective need to see that to believe it. Like, first of all, that's messed up. We know that it's been going on for years, and second of all, seeing that is not normal. You know, looking at that is not normal. You know, it's the last minutes of someone's life. I'm thinking of, because I know there was photos, and I think there was videos of, there was videos of both, you know, Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. But yeah, I just kind of want to reiterate the fact that, like, it's good that it's being framed, but I believe, and I don't think I'm alone in believing that those videos belong in a courtroom and they don't belong, I don't think that, I mean, I understand why people do it in the sense of raising awareness, but I think that if that's where we're at, that we need to see that, it's, it's even worse than we think, like.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like going on from that, we're so desensitized to Black and brown bodies being killed. Like, would we see white bodies in the same instance? Probably no, because we have too much respect for them. And as Aesop said, it shouldn't have to be that we're seeing, somebody getting suffocated to death for us to act. We should acknowledge and listen to Black and brown people who have been saying it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so for me, like, it's actually kind of like an emotional overload, just, in this time, just scrolling through social media, like seeing like Black and brown bodies dying. Like, it's so much, and it's like it's kind of, it's unfair for Black and brown communities to see this, because they're facing it, they know. So why do we have to put it there for white people to acknowledge? We need to just be listened to.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight to you the problem of racism is of such a magnitude that even while we are dealing with a global pandemic that has been killing people relentlessly, racism still takes a highlight in the media during that time and then overtakes the conversation around COVID-19. And that's how major this problem of racism is. And it's leaving us powerless to some extent, having to go through this consistently and constantly, because if a global pandemic that has been killing hundreds and thousands of people daily cannot even give us a break from racism and the way that Black bodies are slaughtered, then how are we going to defeat this demon that is literally infused into our daily lives across the world? So I think it's almost that type of hopelessness that resides within seeing our brothers and sisters being killed off like it's nothing and sitting powerlessly, and you want to do something. I mean, if you listen to the bystanders that took the videos, they were too afraid to step in because it could have been them. And in a society of human beings, you would think that when you see a need, it would be fine for you to step in and try and help. But it's not the world that we live in right now, especially if you're black, black and brown. So I hear what you guys are saying. I think we still need the capitalist system to some extent, not to the greedy side of how people are over extracting, but to a point where we can still provide for all people, especially those in need. And the videos, it was Will Smith who said that it has been around for a long time. It's just being filmed now. And while these videos also belong in a courtroom, if it wasn't for the public outcry, a lot of these guys would have gone without anything happening. In the Aubrey case, it happened in February. We just found out about it now. So if these videos do not come out in the public, then we can't hold them accountable. I think it was Von Jones that said that we need to have it displayed publicly. That is the only way we can have it as a powerful tool to convict these criminals. Yeah. So thank you for indulging me on that point. And I just think that while I have a platform where we can discuss on a global conversation, maybe some of this thought for the next time, we can come up with ideas of how we can enhance our voice to save more Black lives and to educate more white people on how to be less white and more human. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything else that they would like to say?
There's a few things in the comments.
Ooh, Gina, did you want to speak? Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a thought, if that's okay. So I just want to say thank you to you both. This has been a really wonderful seminar, really interesting. I wanted to come back to a point that you made briefly, Lisa, about XR and comparing the objectives of the UK XR movement with the US XR movement, and the fact that, like, in one of the demands in the US XR movement, they kind of have written in there about like racial justice, and it's kind of something that I've been noticing generally, that racial justice just seems to be a lot more at the forefront of activism in the States than it does in the UK, and I guess this is just a kind of a thing that I'm thinking on at the moment as to, like, why that is, because I'm concerned that the potential kind of conclusion that could be drawn from that is that, oh, we just don't have so much of a problem with it in the UK, which is absolutely not true. So yeah, I'm just kind of wondering about why we have such reticence in the UK to put racial justice at the forefront of our activism. And
yeah.
Interested to hear anyone's input on that, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. I feel like in the UK, we have a tendency to think that we are, like, above the US in terms of, like, race relations, because, you know, it's not like in the UK, Black and brown people are being, like, shot down by police. However, I think it's irresponsible for people to believe that this places us, like, above them, because I feel like the racism is more covert. And I think I read somewhere, so at the moment I'm trying to write a book about racism in the criminal justice system. And I read somewhere that the disproportionality of Black people in the UK prison system is actually worse than the US. And so I just think that it displays in different forms. And like you said, I think maybe that's the reason why Extinction Rebellion UK haven't placed it at the forefront, because, you know, perhaps they feel that we live in a post-racial society. But yeah, I do think it is problematic to see ourselves as, you know, morally superior to the US.
Yeah, I think I'd like to chip in a tiny bit with a French perspective. I haven't really seen I mean, I know XR are definitely active in France, but I don't know how active they are compared to in the UK, because I know they're so big in the UK. But in France, especially, you know, I've totally done that myself, and I used to really believe this, is that, so in France, we don't use the word race at all. It's super taboo to use the word race. We've actually taken it out of our constitution. You can't, you know, in the UK and in the United States, you can ask statistics. Well, you can create statistics based on race. So for example, you know, for like censuses and things like that, you can say like, I identify as Black British or Black Caribbean or Irish white or whatever. And in France, you absolutely cannot do that. That's really taboo. And I think that in France, we really see ourselves as like racially more advanced than the United States, because look, we don't talk about race. And the rationale is, we don't talk about race, therefore racism doesn't exist. And it is so detrimental. And I just kind of wanted to bring it in because it doesn't really actually help with what you're saying, but it's just kind of pointing out that there is even, I don't know if it's even worse, but I kind of want to argue that it is, you know, it's kind of, because it's, I'm not going to put them on a hierarchical level, but it's just like, you know, it's colorblindness taken, you know, even further, you know, it's not, you know, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, like you saw, you know, color blindness. In the US, I feel like now it's almost acceptable because, you know, of Trump and because of the rise of, you know, the far right. It's now openly acceptable, because if our president is saying these things, then we can declare ourselves as racist. And maybe like on an overt level, the US looks, you know, worse because they are overtly saying, okay, I'm racist, blah, blah, blah. But in the UK and within France, you know, it's this thing of colorblindness. Like racism is still there, even if, you know, we're blocking our ears, closing our eyes and turning around, like it is still there. And colorblindness is just detrimental to acknowledging this and to, you know, fighting against it.
Yeah, and even in France, it's quite interesting because we don't even use words like, first of all, we'll say black in English instead of saying noir, which is the word to say black in French, which is so interesting because it's just a euphemism. And then another euphemism, which I think is more of a danger, I don't know if it's more dangerous, but it's a dangerous euphemism, is we talk about, oh, the issue of the suburbs. And what we mean by that is racial issues, but we never say that. You know, we will say, oh, look at the north of Paris, look at what's going on there, but we'll never say, you know, it's just like, we'll never say, oh, look, there's like social spatial segregation that is aimed at people of like Black people and Arabic people, and that's why they all live in the same areas. But so yeah, colorblindness in France goes deep, deep, deep.
So I'm a football supporter, and I watch all these football across the globe. And I was also of the opinion, to some extent, especially in the UK, that a lot of what you kind of get from outside the UK is that you are living in a post-racial society. And France as well, the colorblindness, you kind of get that understanding. But when you watch football, like me, who supports it heavily, that is where it has been exposed very, very badly, where a lot of racial slurs is thrown towards Black players at games. And there was a whole thing with the France in the World Cup, when they were winning the World Cup, about the Black players being of African descent was not true France or true French players. So I think it's good also to hear from people that are living in those countries, because I'm also an academic working on a PhD, and I look at race and issues related to these things. So it's quite interesting when you have first-hand experience from people who are actively looking at these things to get first-hand information, because yeah, you can't write in an academic or formal space that soccer games, there's some racial slurs, and that being my basis for saying that this country is racist, versus having it from somebody on this platform, it probably means a little bit more in terms of getting it from you guys. So thanks for that.
Yeah. There's lots going on in the comments now. I'm just going to read what Nermeen is saying, because it's just got to do with what I was just saying just now. Also, funnily enough, the French media dealt with George Floyd murder how they dealt with #I am also scared of the police just a few days before, as if they were separate issues. This is a very good point, actually, because there's been a controversy recently in France about a famous French singer, or she's like a public personality, I guess now, and she is I'm actually not even sure where she's from, but she's not white, and she was saying, I think she's more
She's like with Algerian roots.
Yeah, okay, she's Algerian, yeah. And do you want to explain what happened, or would you rather I do it?
As you like. I mean, like,
go ahead, go for it, man.
Okay. Yeah, so she was basically on this like TV show, and then yeah, one of the people that were like sitting around this like round table, there was like a discussion about the police and so on, and then they were saying, yeah, the police is actually like, you know, all this violence act that happened because of corona is actually just because like the police is trying to protect, and it's like bringing this like whole security theory into like yeah, just like say, yeah, it's okay that some like, you know, violation happens. And then she was like, no, it's not okay. And like everyone like in like there like on them were very like, I would say like, I don't know if you watch it like but they were really bothered by how like upfront and frank she was about. She was like, no, it's not okay that there are violations like this, because like what happens to people who look like me is not okay. And like when I see like an officer, like a police person, I'm like very scared. And like this is like why like the banlieue and like what is in the suburbs of Paris, like why is it very hard for like police to be there, because there's like a state of fear and state of violence that is created by the police. And then like the next day the Minister of Interior just like files a case against her for like yeah, because she's like ruining the police picture, and like she's like propagating like racist comments whatsoever, which is like not, of course, like not the case here. And then one day later, like this whole thing happens. So like first, and then you can see all like the media just like talking about the US as if it was the worst country like in the world, and like how they're like dealing with post Black Lives Matter. It was like literally like what the fuck? This was yesterday that this thing happened like on live on TV, and you just like pretend there are two separate issues. And it's just like, for me, like this is like also like part of why like some people like still in France do not think it's a problem, because like they're being treated as two separate issues. It's like a secret, like here is a problem with racism, whereas in France it's just a problem of security.
Yes. Yeah.
And people buy into that shit because like think, oh, it's not racism, it's security. But
yeah.
like when it's racism, oh, it's outside, it's not here in France. So I thought like it's really like enraging for me.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to make you even more enraged. But two days ago, our National Assembly proposed a bill to make it illegal to, well, basically to, wait, let me find the exact thing. They proposed a bill to make, to anonymize the police officers when they're filmed or taken photo, like photographied, whenever it comes up in media, whether it's social media or other forms of media, in order to make it, and basically, and you risk, if this law passes, you risk up to 1 year of imprisonment for taking a photo of a police officer, or 15,000 euros fines
which is literally, this is a form of violence. Like, yeah, literally you're taking all like measures of accountability away from like normal citizen.
Exactly.
And like you're making like a case of proving like any sort of like injustice is impossible, because like any evidence will be dealt with as like literally, even if I took it by like chance, nobody would take that because it's illegal.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
That is an infringement on your human rights to have freedom of speech and freedom of movement, because that will bring about more dead bodies without any accountability. It makes absolute no sense. And I think the United Nations is supposed to be part of that discussion and shouldn't allow it to stand.
Yeah. Hopefully the bill was not passed. It was only proposed, but I'm just saying, putting it out there, you know, this is a conversation that our deputies are having, or our local elected members. So yeah. So I'm just going to read through a couple of the things that were written in the comments because we've missed a few of them. So Mamadi has sent us lots of knowledge or lots of resources. So good to find ways of revalorizing our knowledge. We are enough. The global pandemic is and always has been racism. Hashtag racism kills. And then Clara asks, could you explain what you mean by revalorizing our knowledge? So, despite the common repression, we must find again our voices, reclaim them from history, and re-articulate them in ways to reclaim the future. To understand that our knowledge, even from Pythagoras and before, actually was stolen from even more ancient Black cultures, but even in the present, there are a wide range of Black feminist and Indigenous voices who are reimagining histories in ways that really free us to greater futures for everyone. And then 100, Sunitha says 100%. For a brief moment, being in lockdown, there was a feeling of temporary respite from racism. However, just in other ways, I have realized that it is inescapable. Even in the discussion around wearing face masks, yeah, this is a really good point, yeah. France, again. But even in the discussion around wearing face masks, the experience of people of color wearing them is just a different feeling, just like they look instantly suspicious, or those disproportionately being affected in the UK by COVID-19. Then Mamadi says, check out Sylvia Winter, Tiffany Lothabo King, Nokathula Halang Bangane, and we'll try to send all of these resources, and so many more. Frantz Fanon disapproves of the idea of that France is not racist. He's right, France is fundamentally racist. And then Concerning Violence is another resource, which is a good read that people can access the Code Noir online. Concerning Violence is a book written by Frantz Fanon, and there's also a movie. If you'd rather watch a movie, it's very graphic, but I do recommend it because one, Lauryn Hill is the narrator, but also it's a good book. It explains. It's a good documentary. It explains the book Concerning Violence quite well. But the book is also a good read. And Mamadi says it can help people access the Code Noir online, which was applied to Haiti and Dominican Republic in history. And the Code Noir is a code. It's literally called the Black Code. And it's a code of conduct, and to some extent, that was written by Colbert, who is a French philosopher or like famous thinker. We've all learned about him in school, but he published this code of how to treat your enslaved people, or the Black people that you have enslaved. And so it was basically things like I mean, I haven't read it myself, but like, you know, it's specific things that you do. So, you know, they run away once, you cut off one leg. Anyway, it's just instructions kind of things to do, but I think it's also much more than that. So anyway, Concerning Violence. And then Mamadi also adds, XRUK is suffering from deep colonial amnesia. Oh, sorry, Concerning Violence is just a chapter inside Wretched of the Earth. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. And just to aid access, and yes, the film needs trigger warnings. You're right. And so I'm just going to read the comment that you wrote before, which was, XRUK is suffering from deep colonial amnesia and the difficulty in facing trauma of the violence of their history, strongly implicated in the Anthropocene violence. The Anthropocene violences of environmental exploitation. Also, on the French, consider how critical many of the Enlightenment thinkers were in the formation of colonialism. I mean, look at Descartes. So yeah. You're full of good resources, Mamadi. You need to.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for sharing all of this knowledge.
So yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I'm not sure if you guys talked about it, but like maybe on my last point, which is basically like that we should like stop educating more or less like white people through like pictures of Black people being murdered. Like, cause like, no, seriously, like this whole video of like George, like I didn't open it. Like I didn't open it because like I knew it was too much and I didn't open it. But then I was just like shown to, like, it wasn't my choice to open it. But then I was like, this is not okay anymore. Like I think we are beyond the stage of just like using those pictures to educate white people, and it's very like I think it's very disturbing for me that we have to still be at that stage. It's not okay anymore. And like my second point was like the violence. And to be honest, like I'm like, you know, seeing, it's not like, you know, that I'm justifying for violence, but I'm just saying that here it's like, I don't think like our interpretation of violence like is different here, because these are an act of oppressed people, like against their oppressor, which is basically like, was like in the Minnesota was like the state of the police. So I'm like, it's, I don't know, I'm very conflicted about this, but like at the same time we're dealing with a system that is made to oppress these people, and and it's not okay anymore just like to keep using those images and like tell them to shut up, you know, just like violence is not okay. Like how, I don't know, I'm just like very, like I've said, like this whole 2 days have been really like, yeah, consuming and tiring for me, and I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, it is an interesting question because as Edwin said, like,
Nina, I just want to say I see you and I hear you, and you're not alone.
Amen. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is like the debate, because as Edwin said, you know, it has taken these videos to, you know, bring people to account. You know, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, it took this video for somebody to do something. But yeah, it is just, you know, I said this earlier, it is just mentally like taxing, because we know now what these videos are like. We've seen enough of them that we can create in our minds what it is like, and we are becoming desensitized. And, you know, people now that are talking about, like, you know, the violence happening like because of this, I think it is justified, you know, like as you said, they're just acting to fight against their captivity, to fight against their oppressors. So I would say that violence is justified in some instances for sure, like against your oppressor.
Well, especially if you're on the receiving end of so much constant violence. There's a point where, you know, after a certain number of hundreds of years, you see the dialogue just doesn't work anymore. And so,
and I mean, like, exactly, like the other point for me was like, you know, when I finally had to watch the video, like I was watching someone taking a video of someone who was being killed, and nobody did anything. And like, I didn't know like which was worse at that point, you know. I'm like, literally, we are going to watch them die. This is how it is right now, apparently. And that's for me why, like, you know, when they burned, like, you know, the state, like, you know, the police, I'm like, you know what, if nobody intervened and the person died in front of your eyes while you're taking a video, and nobody intervened, like nobody just like thought of pushing him or just like whatsoever, you know, it's just like very, very disturbing that we got at this point where we just like taking a video and watching someone die. This is how normalized it is, the death of a Black person. Like, this is how normalized it is. It's he's dying by. That's how, like, yeah, it's very disturbing.
Yeah, it is very normalized.
On the question of using violence, I think that has been the grace and for white people, that Black people are so compassionate and loving. If it wasn't for that nature within Black people, there would have been a mass killing of white people a long time ago. And this might also be due to the Christian upbringing that we had, that is part of our colonialism past, where we were infused with this Christianity of turning the other cheek and being the lesser within all conflict situations. And that to some extent has made us almost victims of that system, that we are always at the receiving end. And I'm one that says in South Africa that we are moving towards a civil war if white people don't come to the table and understand our hurt and our pain that we are dealing with daily. We are moving towards that civil war. And I think it's similar across the world, because you can only take so much until that anger is turned into some form of weapon that is going to be not nice, because a war has never been good to any side in any country. But it's, as you say, how much more do we have to take of this before people return some of that anger?
And you know what we're talking about now, it actually reminds me, so I'm going to quote the late great Tupac Shakur, and basically in an interview he basically talks about how within his raps he's got more aggressive. People are now saying, you know, F the police and all of this, and the interviewer is asking him, you know, why are you so aggressive, why are you saying you want to do this and that to the police? And so he uses this amazing analogy, which I'm going to tell you now. So he was just like, you know, if there was a room that was locked off, and in this room there was like loads and loads of food and just lovely things, and somebody had locked the door, and there's people outside that room. Those people, you know, are hungry. They don't have access to these things. They're going to be out there, you know, they're going to start off, you know, knocking on the door like, hi, can we have the food? Hi, can we have the food? You know, with no response. So they get a bit more rowdy. They start singing, you know, we are hungry. We want food. We want food. You know, the door does not open. And so now, you know, they're knocking on the door, asking, you know, we want food. You know, we want rights. We want all of this. No response. So eventually, you know, Tupac then says, you know, eventually they're going to come in with their AKs and start shooting down the door to get the food, because it's been denied from them. You know, this justice has been denied from these people. So, you know, how far, like, how long do you have to wait? Like, when you're not getting any response, you need to then change your tactics.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a rich conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so much input, and that's been really amazing. And I just also wanted to add that it's, as a traditional healer myself, people dying online, it's not a very beautiful indigenous for the spirit of the person. And it's also not the first time. I mean, we didn't have social media, but people were being lynched and groups were being invited to watch that. And lynching was done in Namibia during colonial times by the Germans as well. And it had to be done in public to discourage the communities from revolting. So, and I mean, in the US, they even used to make postcards after of the lynching and send it around. So it's also, it has this double edges, you know, it's a painful situation because it continues to give power to white supremacy, actually, when they see us die publicly online. But at the same time, it creates somehow, sadly, this space of finally talking about things. But it shouldn't be, in an ideal world, it shouldn't get to that somebody loses their life online for us, for white people, not for us, for white people to start talking and wanting to do something. So yeah, but this is where we are at, unfortunately, and this is really a sad part of it, from that perspective of the spirit of the soul of a person having to respect how they die and to respect their family and their community and how they choose to mourn that person. Yeah, so that touched me a lot, what you just shared about your concern on having to watch videos of people dying online.
Yes. Mamadi writes, thank you, Nanti, for reminding everyone of the spiritual aspects and energetic aspects of these violences.
Mm.
Okay, if anybody, if people don't have anything more to share, perhaps we'll call this to an end. Iso, what do you think?
Yes, I think it's a sad end, but yes.
Something for us to ruminate on and think about, and we'll see how we can act upon. But we'll just make a note that these seminars, or our next seminar, will be in 2 weeks' time, the same on Thursday again at 8 p.m. Greenwich. Iso, well, perhaps this one's on Tuesday, isn't it?
Oh,
anyway,
yeah, I think this one is going to be on Tuesday, yeah.
We'll put the details out there, and that one's going to be on feminism and the whiteness within the feminist movement.
So yeah, feel free to join us. And again, thank you so much for everyone for joining us. It was really, it was a very rich conversation. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody for taking time out, a few hours of their day out of their day to come and listen to us and listen to each other. And I'm glad that everybody was freely able to discuss. And yeah, I hope that we can see like the same faces in 2 weeks' time. And if you haven't followed our social media, we're Whiteness with an X instead of an I.
I'm right in the chat.
Yeah. And we'll post the video of this tomorrow and some resources for you guys.
We'll compile all the resources that we've used, the sources of our articles, if you want to look into it. And also everything that was shared in the chat here we'll also add.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.